my talk is more focused on the extent to which research is itself stigmatized. Okay, so anyhow, this is it's kind of, I don't know if it's humorous, but anyhow, it's called Through the Community Looking at Understanding Reducing Stigma Harms in HIV and Drug Abuse Research, Case Examples from our Institute. So what happened was that NIDA asked me to give a presentation to NIH program officers on the stigma research that our RETI fellows had done. And none of our fellow, there was no research that ever was called anything about stigma. Because everything was ethics or drug abuse or things like that. And I'm saying, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I went through all the articles, 50 some odd that have been written so far by RETI fellows, and Rima helped me. And we found lots of it had to do with stigma. We just didn't call it that at the time. And as John is pointing out, there's a lot more grants now that are really focused on stigma, and that wasn't, the case, especially early on. So what I'm going to be reporting on is these, all of these illustrations and what it means about the extent to which participation in research itself is stigmatizing. And I think that's something, very, very different. So once again, Goodness of Fit Ethics draws on the Belmar principles to guide the design of research procedures to best fit the needs, values, and lived experience of stigmatized groups, which is what we work with. Now, how do you transfer those Belmar principles into something we want to be thinking about? So, in terms of respect, how might anticipated stigma influence a person's decision to participate in our research? How might, in terms of beneficence, are surveys, interviews, or other data collection methods experienced as stigmatizing? Justice. Do our inclusion and exclusion criteria exacerbate internalized or enacted stigma? Although I feel embarrassed now with John's presentation, using those terms still. Okay. But as I said before, good intentions are not enough because members of stigmatized groups may view our research benefits and harms and the values of what we're doing very differently from the most dedicated and well-meaning members of the scientific establishment. So, research ethics through a participant's lens, what are these examples from the MRPs from Institute? Well, many of them identified stigma-related barriers to research participation, illuminated bias in research designs that exacerbate stigma, and provided data to guide the development of compassionate and destigmatizing ethical and data collection procedures. So, I'm going to talk about, let me just get some water. I'm going to talk about basically two categories of research that when we were doing this content analysis, and these are on all the studies that were qualitative, not the survey studies. What I found was they really, we had the most in two different groups. One was in women who were involved in sex work, and the other is men who have sex with men who are involved in substance abuse. So those are the two categories I'm going to be talking about. So I should take the water. Okay, so if nothing else, they always treated me as human. A lot of our research that we've supported with females who are involved in sex work has been international. And you'll see that, so you'll see from Peru, from India, from the Philippines are some of these quotes from our RETI fellows. So here, I mean, this is such a poignant comment, when you think about it, that if nothing else, they always treated me as human, which really, I think, speaks to how they feel they're looked at and treated in their daily experience. So this category of responses were recruitment barriers, this fear of disclosure. And as this woman said, embarrassment is the worst enemy of women. And here you can see a quote from India. I was afraid. I had never participated. So this was a retrospective that Elizabeth Reed did on a study that had been conducted, and then she went back as part of the MRP to see how the woman had experienced being in that study. I was afraid. I had never participated in such interviews and never signed on any paper before. I was with fear my story would be given to the newspaper and people would know about me. So it's very interesting. What I have found is no matter what you say in informed consent, if it's really not tailored to understanding what their fears are, the informed consent is not that helpful to them, as hard as we try. And this is very interesting too, because many people don't think about women who are involved in sex work as having families. But across the world, many of them are supporting their families through their sex work. So here, the 3 fears that kill women. They fear being singled out by society, that the husband may find out, and that being HIV positive or carriers of a disease. And remember, all this research is about HIV. So there's a certain amount of fear of even finding out you're HIV, or not only of having other people find out, because it can reduce your livelihood. So there was also discussion that indicated barriers to informed and voluntary consent. Being, as this woman said, being informed of consent helps me feel better, but does not make me completely trust you. And as this woman said, discuss our rights at the beginning so we know what to do if the interviewer fails to follow what we've discussed, especially if they're from the clinic or city hall. Again, this power differential where they see a researcher coming from government. When a lot of times, we may mention NIH, or we may, I did that once with a group that I was, a group of, an African-American parents group, and I was saying, I'm here, I got an NIH grant, blah, 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 I want to tell you a story. And they said, well, you're an agent of the government. It doesn't even matter what your intentions are, because if you get an NIH grant, the government has intentions with your work. So, it's very important to be thinking about this as you're interviewing or working with your populations. Here's another one. And this is another issue. Just like many women who are involved in sex work have to get permission from their brothel to be in the study, or are prevented from being in the study by their brothel manager. I do need permission from my brothel manager, the owner. If she says yes, okay, then I will go. If she says no, well, even if I want to go, I can't. You, the investigator, should talk to the owner so that when you come to invite us, they're already informed. And of course, this raises those issues that have been addressed by Sackharp and others in terms of what do you do when permission, in some sense, has first to be sought by a more powerful agent than the participant themselves, and how do you continue to respect the autonomy? We can talk about that at some point. Okay, so this was a theme that came across as disrespect and response validity. Sometimes we don't want to come because they can accuse us of sex work. Now, when she used the word accuse, what she was really saying was that the staff, the research team, was so disrespectful to them. And, the articles, I hope you get to read them, they're on our website. The researcher would make the women sit in a group and ask, do you have HIV? Do you go for CD4? Since how long have you been in the sex profession? And they really felt that if they weren't a sex worker, these kinds of questions would never be asked of them, and certainly not in a group of other women, as if they didn't have any privacy. So it becomes very important that even the researchers who are doing this research do not have their own stereotypes of these women that mean that the procedures themselves are disrespectful. And I think what's interesting, Kate, in terms of community workers and then have to be conducting these kinds of things. We aren't, and so here's an issue, and that I'll get back to in terms of validity, right? So, because if they're disrespected, why should they be truthful? We aren't so open to say truth. If you ask if I have oral sex, I feel ashamed that the interviewer should know that. So I say I don't. Okay, and so here's the perceived exploitation and response validity again. And I feel this is one of the ways we can really communicate to other researchers. Remember when I said good ethics is good science? Because if people don't feel respected, then they're not going to tell us the truth, and our science is not going to be very valid, or they're not going to participate, like Liza's study, right, where the people said, don't use my data. So as this woman said, they should have a kind heart. If researchers talk to us only for their salaries, if they say, I am asking this and you have to answer like this, naturally we will think of giving false responses, thinking that they are working only for the money. And this reminds me also of what we talked about yesterday in terms of relational ethics and how important that is for our participants when we're working with them. We'll tell our problems only when they talk affectionately with us. Again, the relational issues in establishing trust. But all is not bad. You know, we have some good. Doing good well is destigmatizing sex work. How do we do that? Even in the interviews we're doing. I was treated very well. With these studies, we learn to be open in good fellowship. It helps us a lot because we are very stressed out in those places. You help us a lot because we mostly don't talk to other fellow workers. In you, we find a different piece of advice. We find consolation in talking to someone. So if we're doing, if we're doing our research and we're treating people with respect, and good research can be an intervention in people's lives. And I think as we design our research, we should always be thinking about that. What is the experience of being in the research itself, and how can we contribute to these people who are contributing to our publications and our grants and everything else? Okay, so then these are quotes from our RETI fellow articles that talked about the impact of stigma in research involving men at risk for living with HIV and addiction. And here's, this is also such a poignant quote. We are their neighbors too. Okay. So this theme was research distrust. They've been doing us dirty for a long time. Okay, and this is a black man living with HIV. So I don't know if the money. So first they talked about funding, how they don't trust the government. They trust pharmaceutical companies less than the government, but they don't really trust the government. I don't know if the money train hits government the same way. The government might be less inclined to organize a very exploitive study versus pharmaceutical companies. But the other quotes from these were that the government's not too good either. Recruitment. I love this one. They are only recruiting us because we're hot right now. In a few years, they will have a new focus, and it will be like, what happened to the black gay men with HIV? Wow. So true, And screening. Researchers tell us it didn't work out for you, and I can't tell you why. It feels like exploitation because I can't even give you an answer, and it's like I just used you. And I thought this was very meaningful because a lot of times we just screen people out. And it's one thing when you're doing an online anonymous study, right? And they've spent a minute online. But it's another thing, like we were talking about yesterday, they come with they come in cravings, withdrawal, or they're high, but they've made the effort. And we just, sorry, no, or maybe they're not taking the right drugs, and we don't pay them, and so I think we really need to be thinking about their efforts and what it means to screen somebody out. So this was another barrier to participation, and it's research conducted by strangers, right? And as this man said, walk in my shoes. In order for me to trust you, I have to feel like you have walked similar spaces that I have, so you can understand where I'm coming from. Here's another quote. The person that gave me the coupon. Now this is, Roberta Abadi's, once again, a reflective study on how they felt being in Roberta's study, and they had done a lot to be in the community for many years to establish trust, and you can see that that person is describing that. The person that gave me the coupon told me about the study. I have known him for years and I trust him, so when he thought about it, I thought, why not? And this has to also do with respondent-driven sampling. Although there are also studies which show that can be coercive, right? Especially when they take a piece of the compensation. So one has to be very careful about that. This I love too. It's the wrong question to ask, how can we get black folks to trust these white researchers to come and get their personal health information? The question really should be, how can we find more black researchers? Okay, and here's research harm, stigmatizing, targeting, and labeling. What happens when we recruit? And here, this may, be interesting in terms of what John was talking about. I don't even identify as gay. It's not who I am. If I see, this I loved, especially living in New York City, this was a New York City study. If I see an ad for HIV research on a train or on a bus, that it's targeted within a certain group, and it doesn't feel okay. I mean, any of you have read the study. It's always Hispanic, it's always black. Come be in the study, and and here's the other one. These ads or this recruitment may put ideas in their friend's head. Well, I see that it says HIV and they're recruiting for gay men. So obviously either all gay men have HIV or they're at higher risk. So, we tend to think about dangers of drug use and police, but we don't think about how our recruitment or advertising may also be stigmatizing a population, which maybe is something we were talking about in terms of third parties. And here, once again, people don't think about people who use drugs as having families. I have my daughters, and they don't know their dad is an addict. I didn't want to have my picture in a magazine or in TV, and my daughters can see me. So once again, this fear, not really understanding that a researcher is probably not putting things on TV. But just like that sex worker who also thought that it was the government. And this is a young boy in Thailand. Being gay, it's like making my parents set their hopes and they all fall apart. See, I'm the only son in the family too. Well, Dad has set high hopes for me, and I'll just like not rejoin the study at all. And this was a study in Thailand about having to get parental consent for young MSM, and why this youth would not be in it. Not just because he was afraid, which we typically talk about, but the issue of respect for his father's hopes for him. Okay, so this one is fear of legal exposure, which one wouldn't be surprised. When you're using drugs, you're doing wrong. You don't want somebody watching your every move. When we first saw you, we didn't know who you were. We suspected you could be an undercover cop or a snitch. They infiltrate the area to get information. And I'm not going to tell nobody where I buy or use drugs for fear of somebody going to send the police. That's the code between drug sellers and drug users. You don't tell. It reminds me of what you were talking about in terms of they know what other people in their community are going to do. So I think they know better than us, perhaps. These were really interesting to me. These were the studies that our fellows have done in mHealth and what the research burdens and harms were. So here, for example, we do all these studies, and here, for example, somebody says, I don't have time for that. I don't want your messages, or geospatial mapping. A lot of these drugs make you very paranoid. So this was a study in terms of whether you're either geospatial mapping, or the other study was on giving reminders to take HIV pills or medication for substance use. A lot of these drugs make you very paranoid, and you know who's calling, and they want you to answer questions. If I'm getting high, I don't think I'm going to stop to answer it. I don't know if an app would even help me, because you send me a text saying take your meds, and if I'm doing meds, I'm not going to take it. I mean, what was interesting, if I'm high, you think I'm going to listen to a message? And, so I think in terms of feasibility of these mHealth studies, this is very interesting. And here's another one which was saying, when you're pushing me like that, that put me in a bad mood, and I won't even bother to answer. So not only feasibility, but the potentiality that we're reminding them about their HIV. for example. That's what this particular study was about. So we tend to think of the goods of M Health and how wonderful it is if we can send messages and remind them to take their drug, but participant responses are important in letting us understand the potential harms or lack of feasibility. So what does this all say? I love this quote. When I first started doing this research, as you can see, in 1996, I was really, very much influenced by, feminist ethics as well as Gooden, who talked about that vulnerable people ethically require an obligation for those who are not vulnerable, and that the obligation lies in us. It's a moral essentiality. But anyhow, I love this quote. Those of us who study lives are aware that we influence the lives we examine. Perhaps very little, perhaps a great deal. And I really think that that's, one of the theme songs or themes of our institute, is that we are collecting data that understand that we have an influence on the people that we study, and hopefully we're going to let other people know that. So, no matter how much we think that we are being respectful, there are power asymmetries in research involving stigmatized groups. We decide what the inclusion-exclusion criteria is. We decide how participants will be identified and recruited. We decide on the content of the informed consent. We decide the scientific and social validity of the study, the hypothesis to be tested, the measures and methods employed, the post-test assessment, and whether or not they have access to the drug or the intervention that we're actually testing when the study is over, and how and where the results will be disseminated. And of course, we stress community engaged research, but that's really hard to do. And it's really, and not everybody does it. And so these power inequities exist, and we have to recognize that. So in goodness of fit ethics, how do we reduce these asymmetries? Well, we do this by seeing research through a participant lens. We develop inclusion and exclusion criteria that reflect how participants see themselves. That's why I think it's so important about John's work, because it's really shedding a very different light on how individuals see themselves. We reassess how recruitment methods may exacerbate internalized stigma or reinforce social stereotypes. We enhance confidentiality protections through understanding of participants' specific disclosure fears, not just the ones we imagine. We create informed consent procedures that adequately address participants' real-world concerns. Remember, I think it was yesterday when, this is in a vaccine hesitancy study I did, where a woman was afraid that the COVID vaccine would hurt her child's organs. And even though there's no evidence of that, nobody says that. They just always talk about side effects. So in getting parents to give their kids vaccines, they're not addressing parents where they are. And finally, we design interventions tailored to participants' lived experiences. So what are the research essentials for thinking about your MRP research designs? First, pilot participant reactions, which is what you're doing in your MRPs, basically, to propose procedures to reduce stigma barriers and increase population-tailored protections, scientific validity, and social value. Do bidirectional debriefing to evaluate the congruence between study intent and participants' experiences to improve interpretation and future design. That's what's so great by some of our MRPs that are asking people, what was your experience in this parent study? Did it really meet the expectations that you had in the informed consent or when we recruited you? And train staff to implement research procedures that avoid reinforcing societal stigmas and that are empowering and destigmatizing. So seeing the eyes through the eyes of our participants and the research you're going to do gives voice to those whose voices have been unheard. It enhances investigators' human responsiveness to those who participate in our research. It encourages scientific humility. and increases investigators' awareness of the limits of their knowledge and the obligations to participants, so that we can create a research enterprise that reflects participants' lived experience and merits their trust. And thank you to everybody. Thank you.